How many of you last year were here for Little Pistols? Okay, this is a redo of the Little Pistols presentation from last year. I've reorganized it to put the best practices in one spot instead of spreading them, so the organization is a bit different. And a couple of the slides are updated, but just wanted to give you fair warning ahead of time. Hopefully there's some things in there maybe that you've missed, but that's what this is. We maybe should have kept the title the same. But the focus is still the same, how to improve your score. And the way to do it is still the same, getting psyched ahead of time, prepare for it, and then execute. And these are the things we'll talk about. Getting ready, we'll talk a little bit about hardware and software, and then we'll talk a lot about operating practices. So in most things that you try in life, most enterprises or contests or competitions, the more of these elements you have, the better off you are. You'll find successful enterprises do these things, and they apply to contests as well. What does a right frame of mind mean? Get your head in the right space. This is a competition. We're all in this great fraternity of radio amateurs, and we're in this subset of contesters, and we love each other very much. But when you're in a contest, it is a competition, and you should put your head in that space. You won't be alone. QRM is a fact of life in contests. The more you're bothered by it or the more you complain about it, the worse your performance will be. So you need to, if not embrace it, learn to live with it, learn to extract intelligence out of all that noise. And if you don't have that tolerance, as Fred said, K3ZO, you might be able to find another activity that you like a little bit better. And last but not least, and this is a thing that I found helped me the most, is act like a big dog even if you're not. That means that you need to be assertive, don't be timid. I know that if you're a DXer and you have a small station, you found maybe sometimes the right strategy is hang out a while. It's equally important, maybe even more, is when you're running to assert yourself, to have the demeanor of a large station. Think about that. When you hear a big gun in a contest, very often they're weak for reasons of propagation or antenna directivity. They're not very strong. But you know they're a big gun because of the way they comport themselves. You know they have a steady rhythm, they're assertive, they are constantly filling the air with something, whether it's the contact or a fill or a question, they're moving. So you need to act in the same way. You're a big gun, you've got the frequency, people are calling you. Act accordingly, don't be timid about it. And some of that confidence will leak through to everything that you do in the contest. So once in a while you may get nipped, but it's okay. Sun Tzu is telling us to get ready ahead of time. And you should have a strategy of some kind. It doesn't have to be written down. I find that when I write things down, I remember them better, but you don't have to do that. But you need to think through what you expect to happen during the contest. What's going to happen in terms of propagation? How are you going to react to that? What's your plan? When are you going to sleep? All those kind of things where you want to change something, you don't know how. So you'll go to the very easy to understand documentation, just like that. But it's not easy enough that I want to do it in a contest. So I try to learn all those things ahead of time by using that software every day. The other thing you need to do, how many of you run? Does everybody in here run? Yes? Okay. Sometimes in the earlier stages of contesting, you're apt to search and pounce a lot and not run. Conditions aren't great right now, but they still are days when it's favorable and times when it's favorable for you to run. And we'll talk about later on why you need to do that. So you should be comfortable with it. And the best way to find that out is not only use the practice software, but pick a day when propagation's good. You're hearing some part of the world very well on a good band for you. And start working stations in a run style. You know, they get the idea right away when all you say to them is 599K. and sit there and try to run. Even if it's a low rate, get comfortable with the pattern and the rhythm of running. And then assess the way you operate against the best practices that we're going to talk about. And they're all collected together in Appendix A, so you can look at them as a list later on. Have some consideration for what's going on somewhere else. In domestic contests, when we're on the East Coast, I do think about the guys that are going to eat dinner. Not everybody's a contest freak, but they're QSOs. So you'll notice that stations drop off rapidly at dinner time. A lot of people don't get up at 3 in the morning when it's 6 in the morning on the East Coast. So you think about those things, and the same goes for the rest of the world. Part of your strategy ought to be, when do you think things will be good enough to run, and when do you think they'll be good enough when you'll just want to S&P? And set some ground rules in your head about when you're going to change from one to the other. I usually base that on rate, but that's not necessarily the right thing to do all the time. And have it some kind of a general strategy in your mind. Some of this seems very obvious, and you may have thought about it, but until you see it and you're confronted with it, you don't think about it as part of a plan. I like to get a hold of the logs of a couple of other stations in our club and look at what their rates look like. I'm not sure that what I was doing is representative. So this way I get a feel for, did I choose the right times to be off and the right times to be on? I know that I've gotten up in the morning sometimes, not early enough, and said, I missed this huge opening, and I can see it in the logs later on. Everybody was up on 15 or 20 or whatever the band was, making a lot of cues, and I was snoozing because I'd miscalled it. So it's good to look and try to learn from that history. Don't forget about minimum off times, and when you do, keep in mind that you may want to be on very late in the contest. This happens to me in NAQP. I have to, in the middle of the day, I'm starting to ponder, when am I going to start using up the rest of my off time? Because if you use it all up early, then if the bands go long later in the day or late in the evening, you have no time to work. So I try to reserve a half hour or an hour for the end of the contest, the wee hour part of it. And then as things go later, if it doesn't look like I'm going to use it, I make the decision to either use up that time or not. But it's something you need to think through ahead of time, or you just plain run out of time. You'll go to bed early, it's very nice, but you may miss a lot of cues. It's good to have a rate target. You don't necessarily need to program that into your software so it's constantly staring you in the face, but have some idea of how many total QSOs you expect to make in a time. Divide it out and say, okay, my average rate needs to be this number. Keep it in your head, so when you're looking at how you're doing, you can see if you're meeting your expectations or not. More importantly, keep your eye on the rate meter anyway, because it's going to signal changes to you if the rate's getting better or getting worse. If the rate starts to drop, and it does it consistently, and it's below your target rate, you need to change something, whether it's a band or a mode, if it's a multi-mode contest, but something has to change. A few words about the score so that the best practices make sense, because if you don't understand how the way the score affects you, the way parts of the score affect you, then the best practices don't make any sense at all. Total QSOs are what give the multipliers their value. I mean, at the end of the contest, you're going to multiply Qs and mults, and it seems like, gee, it's the same thing. The one multiplies the other, they're both worth the same. No, they're not. Every multiplier is worth this number of QSOs that you have. It's not worth anything more than that. It's a multiplier, but it's worth that large number of QSOs. You will always have more QSOs than you have multipliers. In some contests, the ratio will be 3-4 to 1 for most of us, something like that. Sometimes it's a little bit smaller, depending on how well you're doing, but it'll always be more. So the thing that's going to fuel your score is having a lot of QSOs. So to get the most QSOs in the least amount of time, it's rate. And rate should be driving pretty much everything you do. What drives rate? Being heard, kind of obvious, but hearing others is really important. And for the little stations, it's not quite as big a deal as it is for the big guns. But keep in mind that the more power you run, the more difference in antennas you need to make up for. If I have 20 dB or 10 dB more power than you, I've got to hear 10 dB better to hear you on an equal footing. You know, you can hear me just at the noise level. If I don't have 10 dB better hearing, I'm not going to hear you at all. So the reciprocity thing is great if you're both running the same power and you're not bothered by noise in your neighborhood and all these other good things. But otherwise, you need to work on receive antennas are very important. Chasing down sources of noise is really important. I was struck by yesterday, we were driving from Indianapolis. We flew into Indianapolis and drove here. And we stopped by W9RE's station. He's got a tremendous listeners in a community next to his, somebody's TV set, you know, a couple of 100 yards away. But it's very serious because if you're that loud, you need to hear that much better. And hearing better is important for all of us. I don't know about you, but I've lost QSOs where I simply couldn't hear the other guy and I knew it was some noise source I just hadn't ever bothered to track down. So I've gotten better at tracking down noise sources, not just in my house, but if I think it's my neighbor and I take my little yacht boy over there and I can hear it in his house, that I offer to fix it for him. I've done that on one neighbor. I've fixed 2 things over there to help me a lot on 80. And the other thing is operating efficiency, which is what the best practices are all about. It's about minimizing the time between QSOs. And since QSOs are the thing you're after, where do they come from? And you all have figured this out since everybody told me you were runners. You can generate a lot of good rates when you're S&Ping and you can work these runners. But the real way to generate a lot more QSOs is by running, because the people that call you when you're running are the S&Pers that you will never work any other way. Sure, some of the stations that are running will later collect you, but there's this big, deep pool of people that will never call CQ, and so you'll never work them if you don't call CQ. And the better you hear those guys, and a lot of them are afraid to call CQ because they're weak, the better you hear those guys, the more chance you have of working them. So I call them different tiers. You know, you work the tier 1 stations, they're easy to hear. The tier 2 guys are just a little bit noisy, and the tier 3 guys are the QRPers with a 3-foot wire, and they're very persistent about calling you, but they're QSOs, and if you've got the receive capability, you can hear them. So you'll never make those QSOs if you don't run. So what's the efficiency thing all about? Minimize time in and between QSOs. How do you do that? Well, when you're in QSOs, you eliminate wasted words. You know, please copy my, thank you, all the other things that you've heard. They don't seem like much, but when you add them up from a large number of QSOs, they represent a significant amount of time. And that means your rate has been degraded by doing that. One of the things that I hear an awful lot on phone, I work mostly CW, but I do work some phone contests, is I hear repetition of the same thing. So in my case, I'm in Maryland all the time. I may be guilty of it too. What's my section? Maryland, Mike Delta. Well, okay, if I thought I needed to repeat it, then I should, first of all, I should have said the same thing twice, probably not 2 different things. But why do I repeat it? Do I think I'm not being heard? It's taking me twice as much time to pass that information. So don't repeat things unless you have a good reason for them to be repeat. And when you're asked for a fill, only give what you're asked for. There's a two-part to the reasons for that. One is the other station knows it all, so I mean, you know that you're wasting time by giving him something he already knows, especially if it's a long exchange. But the second part is that he missed it for some reason. Whether there was QRM, QRN, your signal faded, whatever it was, he missed part of your exchange. So it's probably going to happen the second time. There's going to be QSB or QRM or QRN or something that causes him to miss part of the transmission. If you take up part of that time sending him something he already knows, if your luck is like mine, the part that gets through will be the stuff he heard before. So you're much better off take the same amount of time, but send the same thing 2 or 3 times. Don't send him what he knows. The bottom part speaks for itself. You know, I've done this before too. If you don't speak up quickly when you miss something from the other station, you're going to lose the QSO because you're missing information. So don't let somebody go before you get it all. When you call as an S&P station, only throw in your call once, maybe twice, but no more than that. If the conditions are really bad, you might want to do it twice. But if you call many times, first of all, you're wasting the runner's time. He's more apt to call somebody whose call he heard more quickly. And secondly, you're wasting your own time. You may not hear that he's already QRZ'd for another contact. This is part of that attitude of saying, you know, I've got a signal that can be heard. I need to assert myself. And give your whole call. I don't imagine anybody in this room does that, gives a partial call, but I hear that occasionally, and all it does is waste time. Give your whole call. K3ZO has a rule of twice. He also has a rock crusher signal, so twice is a good number for him. If he calls somebody twice and he doesn't get an answer, he moves on. If the guy doesn't ID after a couple of times, he moves on. Twice is a good place to start. You might decide 3 times is good, but you need to pick a number and you need to stay with it because you'll get on the bandwagon of going down, down, down on your rate. It's a trend you don't want to get into. So you decide, I'm going to spend this much time with this guy. If it doesn't work, I'm moving on. Now, if that happens several times, maybe your number's too low. Maybe conditions are bad, your signal isn't that good at this time of day, then you need to pump that up. But start with some low number like 2 or 3 and say, I'm not going to try to get anybody more than 2 or 3 times. I'm not going to fall into a trap of letting my rate go to hell because I want to work him. Doesn't make any sense. And use your band map, even if you're unassisted. If you're unassisted, put calls in the band map. The guy that you called twice, put him in the band map and move on. You can come back to him later. You can create your own spots in your band map. If you're using N1MM, you can set it so that if he's in the input field, as soon as you turn your dial, he's in your band map. It's very easy. Or you can put him in manually. But make sure that the stations that you hear, or that you hear a big pileup on the frequency and you say, I'm not getting involved in that, and you keep moving, put them in your band map. So you have something to go back to when your rate starts to drop. The same thing's true when you're running. You don't want to use wasted words. The thanks and please copy my, all that stuff applies equally there. And on the other side of the fill, ask for what you need. If you need something in its entirety again, you have to be the judge of what caused you to miss it. If it was other stations calling you the first time around, that's okay. But if there's other reasons that you're missing it, you need to judge how much you want to hear at once. If I've missed the entire exchange, I may ask for one piece at a time. It usually doesn't take any more time than having them repeatedly give you the whole exchange and miss pieces of it each time. So my recommendation is, if you're missing the entire exchange, instead of saying give it all to me again, unless you knew it was a one-time piece of QRM or something like that, say to them, you know, give me this part, what's your state, thank you, and you're done. Here's the rule of twice again. You're running and you can't quite get this one guy that's calling you and you know there's other people waiting. Don't waste time. Use the rule of twice, rule of 3 times, but get on with it. People that are waiting, that understand the urgency and trying to keep a rate up, they'll flee. They'll disappear as soon as they see you dragging your feet. Some of them will immediately leave when you don't call them the first time, and that's okay. But the ones that hang out for 1 or 2 more times, they're going to leave immediately if they see you trying to pull somebody through endlessly. So decide, are you going to try to pull somebody through 2 or 3 times? And that's rate dependent. Obviously, if things are slow, you'll spend a lot of time. But if things are moving quickly, don't break your run. Just say, sorry, can't copy you, carry the next guy. Or just say no. If people are waiting for you for the same reason of urgency, speed up. On CW, speed up. On phone, talk faster. Be more brief as you possibly can. They know your exchange. It's not going to be a mystery to them, so you can speak quickly and maybe not quite as clearly. And when things slow down, you slow down too. I like to use a progression depending on how busy things are. On phone, for example, thanks is enough to get the next stations to call you. If that doesn't work, thanks, give your call sign. If that doesn't work, your call sign contest. Just make it longer as things get slower. But when things are hot and heavy, thanks or TU or R or 73 on CW works fine. Of course, every once in a while you've got to give your call. In fact, you should do that frequently so people don't tune by you because they don't hear your call. And on CW, if you do it, make sure you send your call at least 2 times so the RBN knows it's you. Guess the way to sum it up is have a friendly sense of urgency. If you heard Doug's talk this morning, the super check partial. I'm having a, why thank you. I think I'll not answer that. Super check partial is not the Bible. So make sure you hear the call and log the call correctly and don't rely on what the RBN tells you. Don't make up cute phonetics. You know, use the standard phonetics or use the names of places that are often used, cities and countries. Don't try anything else. It's not a great idea. The reason that they're a standard alphabet is so that you can pull things through, so that somebody's expecting it. On phone, remember that there's a bandwidth. There's at least 2 kilohertz, maybe a little more than that you're taking up or that somebody else is taking up. So if you know there's a strong runner somewhere, you want to be at least that far away from them on the side of that sideband. When you're working split, listen on, if you have the ability to listen on your on your transmit frequency, you should do that. If you have 2 receivers in your transceiver, that's nice. If you don't, you need to flip back and forth occasionally. If you can listen on your frequency in one ear and hear the other station in the other, that's the best situation because you can time your call properly. Sometimes you need to move frequency just a hair, especially on CW to be heard. Some people don't have the ability that K3ZO says you need to have, which is open up your bandwidth, listen to all the noise, and extract the signals. So the bandwidths get tighter and tighter and tighter. When the bandwidths are down and the QRM is high, that's one of the times that when you call somebody, the reason he's not hearing you very often is you're not in that narrow bandwidth that he's set, and you need to move yourself around a little bit. Another way to distinguish yourself is send at a different speed. If everybody else is sending at one speed, if they're all slow, send high. If they're all fast, send slow. Just something that makes you different from the other guys that are calling. And if you can adjust the weight on your keyer, that doesn't hurt either. But again, you're not going to spend a lot of time trying to work any one station. So you use 1 or 2 of these techniques, doesn't work, move on. You can come back and get them later. And if you're not accustomed to operating CW, you're not comfortable in it, don't avoid doing it. It's an element. It's just like me and phone. I had to get used to the idea that phone was not my enemy. It's just another contest mode. It's the same for CW. Get yourself into it. Start high in the band where things are slow. That generally is true. And then work your way to the quicker stations later. I don't suggest you call CQ unless you're comfortable doing that, but at least get on CW. If you hear a DX station and the band is otherwise closed, you're hearing nobody from that part of the world, and here's this one guy, and you're hearing him kind of okay. I mean, he's not blowing your ears off. the chances are he's opening the band with tons of ERP. And now if you think he's got the receive capability to hear you, feel free to call him, but don't waste time calling him more than once or twice, because you're not going to work this guy. He's not going to hear you. If he's got 15 kilowatts in some unnamed part of the world, he's simply not going to hear you even with 1.5 kilowatts. There's just too much disparity. He's opening the band up. Early in the contest, S&P is a great idea. I like to use it as a place to find a clear spot to call CQ. So I'll start working up the band, S&Ping at a very, very high rate. And when I hit a spot that looks clear, I ask if it's clear and start calling CQ. You can go back to S&Ping later. Or you can just do clicking on spots if you're working assisted. Click on spot to spot to spot. Very high rates. Not sustainable for the whole contest, but certainly very good. Everybody will be fresh meat, so early in the contest you don't have to be afraid, especially if you have a method to your madness. If you're moving from the bottom up or the top down, you're not going to be on the same frequency again. Then you have a very high probability that you're not trying to work a dupe. If you're clicking on spots, that's not always the case. Sometimes, if you're willing to take the chance, call him and fill in the call later. You just have to rely that he's going to ID very quickly. Late in the contest, you are fresh meat. For the guys that have not been S&Ping, that have been calling CQ, have you ever noticed how on the second day or towards the end of the contest, how popular you are if you call CQ? I mean, you can have the worst signal in the world, and you'll get a lot of responses, because these are the guys that have been calling CQ, and so they're on the other end. They haven't heard you yet. When the bands are good, gotta call CQ. That's your best chance anyway. When the bands are dead, it's a way to drum up activity. So bands are good, call CQ. Bands are really, really bad, call CQ. In between, got to use your judgment. I don't know if you were in the meat locker room, which is over next door, for the last talk that Doug gave. He's a tremendous speaker. But he was talking, the question came up actually. He was talking about it and then the question came up again. Always work dupes when you're running. Always work dupes. Don't tell them you worked them before. Don't ask them when or any of that. Just work them and get it over with and get on with life. You spend more time putting them off than you will working them. This is especially true on CW. I guess it's also a skill on phone. When you hear the station, as soon as you've got it in your head and your fingers are going to put in the letters afterwards, start the message back. If you're using a voice keyer, you hit the button. If you're on your CW, you hit the transmit button for the exchange. Don't wait until you have the whole call sign in the call sign field. As soon as you know what it is, start sending that message out. And stay ahead of the transmit buffer so you can fill the rest of it in. You can't really have a super high rate if you don't do that, because it just 2 letters, 3 letters, whatever it is. Now some software will automatically send for you as soon as you've got 3 letters in, 3 parts of the call. I think it's a little dangerous, so I'd like to do it by hand. But as soon as I hear the call, I hit the transmit and then I furiously type the call in while the exchange is being sent. If somebody calls you with a partial call, and if you were in that room, Doug played some recordings for reasons of LCR checking, but they were good examples of somebody calling you and you don't have the whole call. Don't ask them what their call is. If you have a good chunk of the call, send the exchange along with the chunk of the call. If they're a good contester, they'll come back to you with their corrected call in your exchange and you're done. If you ask them what their call is an unnecessary exchange that happens between the two of your transmissions that you don't need to have if you'd send them the stuff ahead of time. So very often I'll miss the first letter or something because the relay didn't click over or there was noise, or I maybe missed the last letter. It doesn't matter. I send a partial call, full exchange, and 90% of the time the operator on the other end sends his full call, gives me his exchange, and we're through with it. Be sure, though, you let him know you got the call right, or he's apt to remove you from the log. Not a good thing. So on CW, my software sent to automatically send the call back if it was any different than the first call that I gave them. And on phone, you need to be diligent about that and saying, okay, it's W3, thanks, and keep on. How many of you were in that LCR discussion? Okay, it was striking how many QSOs got tossed out because somebody decided to remove it from the log because maybe they didn't get it completely right. It sounded great at your end, and they took it out because they didn't get it all, or they weren't sure you got their call right. So it happens in real life, and you need to make sure they know that you got their call correct. I'm not very good at moving multipliers. Doug had a recording of that too, very good recordings. If things are slow enough, or if you need the multiplier badly enough, I wouldn't break a run to do it. Ask the other station to move to other bands, and have in mind the frequency right away. I mean, beforehand, I'm going to ask them to move to this frequency. So you can very quickly do that, especially if things are slow. You can move from band to band, at least one band, maybe more, to try to work them. This isn't any different than in a multi when you pass them to another band, but you're the guy you're passing it to. Says, can you work me on 160, or can you work me on 80? You give it a try and you go right back again. Don't get involved in frequency fights. It's not worth it. You can try a little bit of assertiveness for a short time, but if it becomes extended, you need to make a deal. Either both you guys move, or if they're ignoring you, you need to move. You need to do something about it, but you can't get involved in frequency fight. It costs you too many QSOs. I'll sometimes, if things have slowed down, I'll look at my log and I'll make fake QSOs with what's in my log from before, just to keep the pace up, to make it look to the other station like I'm not going away. I've got a rate going, and very often that'll be enough for them to understand that you're going to move. It's part of looking like a big gun. There's a collection of all of these in Appendix A. And this thing here, while it's very tempting to do otherwise, this is a very good practice. Don't ever even acknowledge a jammer in any way. In rhythm, in timing transmissions, nothing. Just act as if they're not there. The only joy they get is from thinking they're bothering you. If they don't get that impression, they'll leave. So what else can you do aside from the operating practices? Take a look at what your station is like. You probably know a lot about it, and you haven't really thought about it very much. And look for things that you can improve. Every little increment makes a difference. Antennas are very high on the list. You hear that in every one of the talks here today. Work on your antennas as much as you can. In times of sorrow, with few sunspots, except for 160, the key is height. Get your antennas up higher and higher. The higher the band, the higher you want the antenna. And Frank will show you some, W3LPL has some very interesting graphs that make that point out. Now, he has these graphs for stacks. How many in here have stacks? Yeah, most of us don't. But it's true, it doesn't matter what your antenna's like. Horizontal antennas, get them as high as you can, you'd be better off. So, I look at my trees, gee, that one's grown a couple of feet, maybe I'll try to get it up a little higher. Or, if I trim that tree back, I can get another 10 feet on my tower. I think I'll add 10 feet to it, that kind of thing. So they help you in a lot of different ways. You're probably all set up with all these things, but I never know who's in the audience. So the neat thing about this stuff is it makes you more efficient in a contest, but it also helps you every day when you're on the air. You get the benefit of all that ease of operation, which is part of, again, becoming comfortable with your station. I use a Footswitch even on CW, because sometimes I just don't want to hear all that noise in between the words or letters. So I'll sit on a Footswitch until I'm finished, and I'll let the Footswitch up. Especially if I'm forced to slow down and the delay is going to drop my relays out all the time. On the subject of antennas, the biggest change I made was going to all monobanders. Now again, I don't have a a remarkable setup. Most of my antennas are wire, but I used to use multi-band antennas. I don't do that anymore. I have a monoband antenna for 40, for 80, for 160, an old tri-band beam. But even the tri-bander is 3 monobanders on 1 boom. So try to optimize your antennas as much as you can. If you're not on one, is everybody here on 160? Who's not? If you're not on 160, put something up. Adapt one of your other antennas. It's more multipliers. It's some more QSOs, but it's absolutely more multipliers that you can't make if you're not on that band. It's huge. So find a way to get on 160. There's lots of ideas about how to do that out there. And if you have a way to hear better, to get a better signal noise, especially on the low bands, K9 AY loop doesn't take much room. Something simple in a receive antenna, even if maybe it's just putting an antenna that's away from the rest of them, that will gain you some QSOs too. This is my little antenna farmette. I have a very small property, 75 by 125, and my wife has allowed me to put wires on all 3 property lines. Sorry, Marty. I have an 80-meter dipole across one, and I have the 160-meter lazy U on the other side, and then 40-meter inverted delta loop. They're all at 60 to 70 feet, roughly. And then the force 12's in the middle. Are there interactions between them? Yeah, of course there are. Is that bad? Yeah, it's bad. But I don't have the alternative is to do something worse. Is to start isolating the going back to multi-band antennas away from each other. So that's my setup. It's the kind of thing you can do even with small property, and it's not expensive. I'm assuming everyone here has their radio talking to their rig in some way. Set your software to these options. You want to work dupes. Make sure that you're not surprised by trying to work a dupe and having your software saying, no, 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 that's a dupe, no, no, no. This is part of ahead of time getting everything set up properly. The correct all call signs, again, is a CW feature that will automatically send a corrected call. One of the reasons I like WinTest a lot. I like it because some of that CT training is still valuable. It's a great way to operate. It's a very, very nice, smooth interface. It's a small program. It's fast, and in a multi-environment, it's also very good. But its weakness is it doesn't really have any super features for the single op. The reason I use N1MM now is because it's got the available Qs and mults on it. And if you're using assistance, that's a very, very good tool. So you decide whether you want to be assisted or not. If some of you probably remember if you were in an assisted category, the power didn't matter. You were thrown in with the high power stations. Well, that was a much harder decision to make then. Now it's recognized that you're in a different class, so it's a little bit easier. So if you have more fun with spotting assistance, do it. If it's more fun to you to be completely on your own, that's great too. It's superb. Spectrum displays, waterfalls is going to be another talk about that. In fact, I'm going to go watch it. It's a whole nother subject. We're not going to discuss that here. These are the features I find the most useful. After the contest, you got to think about what you might have done differently. Just sit down, examine yourself. We talked about bouncing what you do against the best practices, but also look at, did I run enough? Or maybe did I run too much and hurt myself because things were bad? And I look at these run rates, they're awful. I could have done better S&Ping. What did you do about mults? Did I chase too many of them and lose rate? Or did I not at least seek some out that didn't? Usually what happens is the mults call you. Eventually you'll work a lot of mults, and then there'll be that number that you're going to have to go out and find, the ones that are never going to do anything but call CQ. So did you do enough of them? And what would you wish was different about your station that would have helped you, realistically? definitely look at the LCR and see what happened, the log checking report. See what things were you think your mistake and what things were somebody else's mistake. So get ready, think about what you're going to do, try to use the practices that the successful contesters use, run, and make some changes. Thank you very much.